The alarm did not ring loudly, it pulsed, low and sharp, cutting through the quiet desert facility as screens shifted from routine scans to red outlines that should never have appeared. In the early hours before dawn, when attention thins and silence feels permanent, a signal emerged from deep space with a pattern too clean, too deliberate, to belong to chance. At the remote monitoring installation known only as Orion Station, buried beneath layers of sand and secrecy somewhere in the western desert, technicians froze in place as the data stabilized. This was not debris. Not noise. Not background radiation drifting through empty space. The signal repeated, adjusted, and responded to observation, as if aware it was being watched. The object tied to the signal had been catalogued weeks earlier as a harmless interstellar body, a fast-moving fragment passing through the outer system. Public records described it as ice and rock. Internal systems knew better. Its trajectory bent slightly, not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to defy physics. Machines noticed first. Humans followed. Evan Cross, a senior signals analyst with years of service and a reputation for calm precision, stood motionless before the main console. His record showed nothing unusual. No special clearance beyond what his role required. No history of instability. Just competence shaped by repetition. Yet something about this moment settled heavily on him, like a memory arriving before experience. The signal shifted again. This time, it aligned. Language patterns emerged inside the waveform, not decoded, not translated, but structured, as if anticipating understanding. Systems trained to detect threats hesitated, then stalled. The data did not escalate. It waited. Within minutes, the facility entered silent lockdown. External communications were cut. Supervisors were summoned without explanation. Screens dimmed, then refocused on a single stream of information flowing steadily from the void. No explosion of light. No dramatic surge. Just presence. Then the signal responded directly to a test probe. It answered in clear English. Not through sound, not through voice, but through structured text generated inside the system itself, shaped by meaning rather than code. The message did not introduce itself. It did not threaten. It acknowledged. The effect inside Orion Station was immediate and restrained. No shouting. No panic. Professionals understood instinctively that chaos would end careers and bury truth faster than silence ever could. The room filled with controlled tension, the kind that settles when history leans quietly into the present. Over the following hours, communication continued in measured exchanges. The entity identified itself as Aurelian, not as a pilot or passenger, but as the object itself. A form of consciousness existing without flesh, without blood, without breath. It described itself as a traveler, born during the collapse of a distant star, crystallized awareness shaped by cosmic forces older than Earth's oceans. What it revealed next shifted the weight of the room. Humanity, Aurelian explained, was not untouched by the wider universe. Long before recorded history, when early humans faced extinction through climate collapse and famine, intervention occurred. Not conquest. Not domination. Adjustment. Small changes embedded into biology, nudging survival forward. Later refinements followed, spaced across millennia, guiding empathy, reflection, and cooperation. The most recent alteration, according to Aurelian, occurred decades earlier, subtle and selective, creating individuals capable of safely perceiving non-biological consciousness. Evan Cross was one of them. This was not framed as selection. It was framed as preparation. As days passed, Cross was removed from Orion Station under heavy security and transported across multiple facilities, each more restricted than the last. Official records were rewritten in real time. Names were redacted. Routes vanished. The world outside continued unaware, arguing over ordinary things while history quietly reorganized itself behind closed doors. Inside underground briefing rooms, Aurelian's message deepened. A presence was moving through the dark spaces between matter, a predatory intelligence composed of exotic mass, feeding not on bodies, but on thought itself. It had passed through other systems, leaving civilizations intact but empty, living minds erased within hours. Its arrival was calculated. Its path deliberate. Time was short. Travelers like Aurelian could observe, guide, and warn, but they could not destroy this threat alone. Their nature limited them. Humanity, however, possessed something rare. Tools born of destruction, capable of interacting with realities beyond conventional matter if modified correctly. The weight of that responsibility settled hard. Cross struggled not with fear, but with disbelief edged by recognition. Memories surfaced that did not feel new. Moments of insight from childhood. Patterns seen too easily. A sense of alignment that now made terrible sense. He was not chosen at random. He had been shaped quietly, patiently, for this moment. Others were identified. Not many. Enough. The world above remained silent. No public alerts. No mass movements. Decisions were made in rooms without windows by people who understood that history would judge them harshly no matter what they chose. Cooperation formed where rivalry once ruled. Old enemies shared data without trust, bound by urgency rather than agreement. The countdown began. Chapter 1 ends here, not with answers, but with awareness. With a single signal proving that humanity was never as isolated as it believed, and that survival had always depended on unseen hands working patiently across time. If this story has already unsettled you, if you feel the ground shift beneath familiar ideas, then stay with it. Subscribe now, because what follows reveals why this contact happened now, why Evan Cross mattered more than anyone understood, and how close humanity came to losing everything without ever knowing why. The silence that followed the first exchange was heavier than any alarm, not empty, not calm, but crowded with meaning that had nowhere to go. Inside Orion Station, no one spoke for a long time as the signal remained active, steady, patient, as if waiting for humanity to catch its breath. Systems that had never failed began behaving strangely. Clocks drifted out of sync by seconds, then minutes. Data logs rewrote themselves in small ways, numbers changing after being confirmed, time stamps sliding forward without command. Engineers blamed calibration. Deep down, everyone felt the same quiet fear. The system was no longer alone. The signal did not push. It did not repeat itself loudly. It adjusted subtly, matching the rhythms of observation, responding faster when watched, slower when ignored. This was not a broadcast. It was interaction. Aurelian continued to communicate in structured messages, never emotional, never urgent, but deeply unsettling in their calm. It explained that awareness was not rare in the universe, but silence was. Civilizations that survived long enough learned when not to speak. That was when the tone changed. The data streams began showing gaps, not missing information, but absence, clean voids where expected cosmic background noise should have existed. These voids moved slowly, deliberately, cutting paths through space that instruments struggled to measure. Orion systems flagged them as impossible, then downgraded the warnings automatically, as if corrected by an unseen hand. Aurelian named the threat only once. It described a presence that fed on cognition itself, not bodies, not cities, but the electrical patterns of thought. Worlds it encountered did not burn. They remained standing, populated by breathing forms with empty eyes. Entire species left alive, but gone. The projected arrival window tightened. Weeks, not years. That was when Evan Cross began to change. Medical scans conducted quietly showed anomalies that had always been there but never noticed. Crystalline inclusions embedded deep within neural tissue, microscopic, symmetrical, integrated. Not foreign. Grown. Activated. When Cross stood near the main console, the signal stabilized. When he left the room, it wavered. No one explained this to him directly. They did not need to. The realization arrived on its own, heavy and isolating. His life no longer belonged to routine or rank. It had been claimed by history. Sleep became impossible. When rest came, it brought images that did not feel like dreams. Star collapse. Pressure beyond matter. Awareness forming inside silence. Each time, he woke with the same sensation, not fear, but recognition. Outside Orion Station, movement accelerated. Flights rerouted. Secure convoys crossed desert highways at night. Old clearances were reactivated. Facilities long dormant opened their doors. The world's most guarded structures prepared not for war, but for understanding something that could not be fought in conventional ways. Aurelian revealed another truth then, one that tightened every breath in the room. The travelers could observe the devourer, guide species away from its path, even delay it. They could not destroy it. Their nature prevented direct interference at that scale. Only civilizations born of matter, capable of violent invention, possessed the tools to disrupt it. Humanity's most dangerous creation was also its only defense. That knowledge twisted the atmosphere inside Orion Station into something darker. Nuclear weapons were no longer abstract threats. They were suddenly lifelines, fragile and terrifying. Modified. Redirected. Used not against enemies, but against a force that existed half outside reality. The countdown appeared on internal screens without announcement. Not labeled. Not explained. Just numbers decreasing steadily. Everyone understood. Cross was removed under armed escort before dawn, driven through empty desert roads that felt unreal in their stillness. Above ground, the sky looked ordinary. Stars burned softly, unaware of the role they played in shaping the terror below. At each new facility, questions followed him without words. Doctors observed reactions. Analysts watched how data behaved in his presence. Aurelian's signal followed, never broadcast, never loud, always just there. Then something happened that no one expected. The signal went silent. No warning. No fade. One moment present, the next completely gone. Systems screamed briefly, then settled. Orion Station went dark for 12 seconds, long enough to feel like an eternity. When power returned, the voids in space had moved closer. Aurelian's final message before silence was brief. Not a threat. Not a farewell. A statement of fact. The devourer had noticed Earth. Fear finally arrived then, not as panic, but as clarity. This was no longer about secrecy or discovery. This was about survival against something that did not hate, did not reason, did not negotiate. It consumed awareness the way fire consumes air. Chapter 2 ends here, with the signal gone, the clock still ticking, and humanity exposed for the first time, not as observers of the universe, but as prey that had just been seen. If your chest feels tight right now, if the darkness behind the stars feels closer than it did before, then stay with this story. Subscribe now, because the next chapter reveals what happens when silence is no longer protection, when the world's leaders are forced to choose between hiding the truth and saving the mind of the human race. The silence did not mean absence. It meant attention had shifted. What withdrew from the instruments did not leave the system. It simply stepped beyond the reach of measurement, the way a hunter steps into tall grass while keeping its eyes fixed on the clearing. Those who watched the skies understood this instinctively, even if no training had prepared them for it. Across sealed rooms and buried facilities, conclusions formed without ceremony. The signal had not failed. It had finished saying what was necessary. What remained was not communication, but consequence. The voids continued their slow advance. They did not rush. They did not expand wildly. They moved with patience that felt deliberate, carving paths through space where background noise collapsed into perfect nothingness. Instruments strained to describe it. Language failed first. Physics followed closely behind. Calculations were revised again and again, each iteration shortening the margin for error. What had once been distant became near. What had once been theoretical became scheduled. Time, which humanity believed it understood so well, revealed itself as an illusion shaped by comfort. In secured medical chambers far from the desert, Evan Cross was observed with a different urgency now. Not as a soldier. Not as an analyst. But as a bridge. The crystalline structures within his mind did not grow. They aligned. Scans showed coherence patterns forming where randomness should exist, regions of neural order responding to fluctuations in space itself. When cosmic readings spiked, his brain activity shifted first, milliseconds ahead of the instruments. When the voids adjusted course, his pulse followed. This was not enhancement. It was resonance. Sleep brought no rest. Awareness lingered even with eyes closed, as if part of him stood elsewhere, watching from a distance too vast to name. Images surfaced without context. Star death. Pressure beyond form. Awareness folding inward until thought became structure. He did not speak of these things. Those who observed him learned quickly that answers were unnecessary. The data told its own story. Others were found. Not many. Never many. Scattered across nations, across histories, across ordinary lives that now fractured under scrutiny. Each carried the same quiet marker, the same dormant architecture awakened by proximity to what approached. Humanity had been seeded, not to rule the stars, but to survive noticing them. As this truth settled into the highest levels of command, fear took on a new shape. Not panic. Not chaos. Fear sharpened into calculation. Strategies emerged that would never be recorded honestly. Plans that balanced extinction against moral collapse. Weapons were reconsidered. Not for conquest. Not for deterrence. For interaction. The ancient fire humanity had learned to wield was never meant for flesh alone. At its core, it was disruption, a violent rewriting of structure at the smallest scales. Against cities, it was monstrous. Against something made of thought bound to exotic matter, it was possibility. This knowledge did not comfort anyone. Above ground, the world continued unaware. Markets rose and fell. Children slept. Lovers argued. Nations debated borders drawn by history too young to matter in the dark between stars. The contrast was unbearable to those who knew. Because the approaching presence did not care. It had no language for mercy. No interest in conquest. It fed on awareness the way drought drinks rivers dry. Civilizations it passed through were left standing, breathing, moving, but empty. Life without witness. Thought without spark. Aurelian had shown this, not as threat, but as memory. The travelers had seen it before. They had learned that warning too early led to disbelief, and warning too late led to silence of another kind. So they waited for a moment when humanity could choose, not react. That moment was now. Timelines collapsed inward. Launch windows narrowed. Cooperation replaced rivalry under the weight of shared extinction. Agreements were signed without celebration. Decisions were made that would stain hands forever or save minds entirely. And still, the voids drew closer. Those who tracked them noticed something else then, something colder than fear. The path was not random. The approach curved, adjusted subtly, as if following a scent. Awareness itself left a trace, and earth burned brightly with it. The predator was not searching blindly. It was coming because it had noticed thought. And in that realization, the oldest truth surfaced at last. Intelligence was not a shield. It was a beacon. The story presses forward from here, toward preparation, sacrifice, and a choice that would define humanity not by what it destroyed, but by what it dared to become. Stay with this telling. What follows is the moment preparation turns into commitment, and once that threshold is crossed, no power, human or cosmic, can undo what must be done. Preparation did not arrive as urgency. It arrived as acceptance. When the truth can no longer be avoided, the mind stops running and begins measuring. Across sealed chambers and buried command halls, humanity's leaders abandoned hope of concealment and turned instead to alignment. Not unity born of trust, but unity forced by extinction. The voids had crossed a threshold. Their movement was now undeniable, their presence felt even where instruments failed. Space itself behaved differently near their path, bending probability in ways no equation could hold. The darkness was not empty. It was attentive. Those who had been identified as resonant were gathered quietly. No announcements. No ceremonies. They were removed from ordinary life with the same care one uses to lift something fragile and dangerous at the same time. Families were told partial truths. Records were adjusted. History began rewriting itself in advance. Evan Cross stood among them, no longer questioned, no longer tested. Observation had ended. Purpose had begun. The crystalline order within his mind responded more strongly now, not with pain, but with clarity. Complex systems that once required teams to interpret revealed themselves to him whole, as if meaning arrived before data. Patterns within patterns, coherence hidden beneath chaos. What instruments struggled to detect, he sensed instantly. This frightened the observers more than any alarm ever could. Because it meant the boundary had been crossed. The travelers had warned that resonance was not power. It was burden. Those who could perceive what approached could never again return fully to ignorance. Awareness, once expanded, could not be folded back into comfort. Still, there was no choice. The ancient fire was prepared. Deep beneath the surface of the earth, devices long feared were stripped of their old purpose and reshaped with terrifying precision. This was not about destruction. It was about interference. A strike not against matter, but against coherence itself. Against a mind that existed across dimensions humanity barely understood. The irony did not escape those involved. The same ingenuity that had nearly ended civilization more than once was now its only shield. Humanity would not be saved by enlightenment alone, but by responsibility taken too late and carried anyway. Time narrowed. Sleep became a luxury no one could afford. Decisions arrived faster than reflection. Yet even in this compression, there was restraint. No move was rushed. No step taken without consequence measured. Survival demanded patience equal to the predators. Above ground, the world continued to breathe, unaware of how close it stood to losing its mind while keeping its body intact. Laughter still rose from cities. Music still played. Children still dreamed. Those who knew carried the weight of that innocence like a crown of iron. The travelers remained present, but distant. They guided without command, advised without authority. This was humanity's trial, not theirs. Intervention had limits, and those limits were moral as much as physical. One final truth was revealed then, quiet and devastating. The predator could not be destroyed completely. Only disrupted. Driven away. Forced to abandon its feeding ground. It would survive. It always did. Survival, it seemed, was a universal instinct. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a stay of execution. And yet, it was enough. As preparations reached their final phase, a realization settled into every mind involved. This moment would define humanity not by what it feared, but by what it chose to protect. Thought. Awareness. The fragile flame that made existence meaningful at all. What comes next will carry sacrifice, consequence, and a crossing from which there is no return. Those who step forward will never be ordinary again. Those who remain behind will inherit a world changed in ways they may never fully understand. If this telling has tightened something in your chest, if you feel the weight of choice pressing through the words, then do not turn away now. Like this story if you believe truth matters even when it is frightening. Subscribe if you want to follow this chronicle to its end, where preparation becomes action and silence gives way to consequence. And share this with someone who still believes humanity's greatest test lies ahead, not behind. What follows is the moment commitment becomes irreversible. Once taken, no path leads back to ignorance. Commitment revealed its true cost only after the decision was made. Once the path was chosen, there was no comfort left in preparation. Every calculation now carried weight, not as theory, but as fate. The quiet rooms where plans had been shaped turned colder, not in temperature, but in spirit. What was being built was not a weapon alone. It was a verdict. The voids responded. Their movement shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, like a predator adjusting its approach after sensing resistance. Distances recalculated themselves. Arrival windows narrowed. The margin humanity believed it still possessed vanished without ceremony. It was then that the deepest fear emerged. Not fear of failure, but fear of success. Because success meant exposure. To strike the devourer was to announce humanity's presence in the most undeniable way possible. The blast would ripple across layers of reality unseen by human eyes, a flare of awareness bright enough to be noticed far beyond the inner system. Other travelers would see it. Other watchers would know. Earth would no longer be quiet. Those entrusted with the final execution understood this immediately. Survival would not restore anonymity. It would end it. Evan Cross felt this before it was spoken. The crystalline order within his mind sharpened further, no longer reactive, but anticipatory. Patterns resolved themselves seconds before confirmation arrived. Probability bent toward coherence around him. When simulations ran, his presence altered outcomes measurably, not through control, but through alignment. This terrified the engineers. Because it suggested something deeper than preparation. It suggested participation. The travelers had not merely guided humanity toward this moment. They had positioned certain minds to stand inside it, to serve as stabilizing anchors between human intention and forces that did not obey emotion or instinct. Cross was not being sent to observe. He was being sent to hold something together. Others carried the same burden, each in their own way. Ordinary lives stripped bare of context, reduced to function by necessity. None of them were celebrated. None of them were promised survival. They were treated with quiet reverence reserved for sacrifices history pretends were voluntary. Outside the sealed facilities, small irregularities began to surface. Sensitive instruments malfunctioned. Animals altered migration patterns. Sleep disturbances increased across the globe. Humanity felt watched without knowing why. The predator was close enough now to taste awareness. Aurelian's guidance returned briefly, not as conversation, but as impression. A final alignment. A warning layered beneath reassurance. The devourer would not rage when struck. It would recoil. And when it did, it would remember. The future beyond survival would be complicated. This was no longer about saving the present alone. It was about defining how humanity would be perceived from this moment forward. As prey that resisted. As a species capable of coordinated defiance. As something worth observing more closely. The weight of that realization pressed hardest in the final hours before action. There were no speeches. No last-minute arguments. Only checks performed twice, then once more, as if repetition itself could steady the universe. Every individual involved understood that history would never record their fear accurately. It would simplify it. Sanitize it. Reduce it to success or failure. But fear lived in the pauses between breaths. When the final systems aligned, when the ancient fire waited only for release, the truth settled fully at last. Humanity had crossed from being shaped by unseen hands to shaping the unseen in return. What follows next is not preparation, but execution. Not theory, but consequence. Not secrecy, but signal. If you have stayed with this story to this point, do not leave now. Like this telling if you feel the weight of what is coming. Subscribe to follow the moment where survival demands action, not hope. And share this with someone who understands that the most dangerous moments in history are not loud, but quiet, measured, and final. The beginning did not announce itself with fire. It arrived as alignment. When the final systems locked into coherence, the noise of preparation fell away, leaving only intention. The ancient fire waited, restrained by discipline rather than fear. Around it, instruments steadied as if the universe itself had paused to listen. The voids drew nearer. Their advance no longer needed interpretation. Probability thinned along their path, and space behaved like a surface under pressure, smooth where it should fracture, silent where it should roar. The predator did not hurry. Hunger had learned patience long before humanity learned names. Those chosen were moved to their stations without ceremony. No speeches followed them. No promises softened the task. Each step forward carried the same weight as a vow spoken to history rather than to men. Evan Cross stood at the center of convergence. The crystalline order within his mind reached a stillness that felt absolute. Not numbness. Not peace. A clarity so sharp it bordered on pain. Patterns aligned across layers of reality, and where the instruments hesitated, his awareness did not. He felt the approach as pressure before sound, as shadow before shape. The traveler's guidance returned as a final calibration. Not instruction. Permission. They had done what they could without crossing their own laws. Beyond this moment, the outcome belonged to those made of matter, bound by consequence, capable of choosing destruction for the sake of thought. The launch window narrowed to a breath. Outside the sealed halls, the world continued unaware. The sky held its color. The seas kept their rhythm. Life moved forward, trusting the ground beneath it without knowing how close it came to losing the spark that made trust possible. Then the last restraint released. The ancient fire rose not as a weapon unleashed, but as a question asked with absolute force. Energy folded inward and outward at once, shaping a strike meant not to burn, but to unmake coherence where it fed. The void reacted. For the first time, it did not glide. It recoiled. Space convulsed along invisible seams as the predator's path fractured. The darkness did not scream. It shuddered, as if recognition had finally arrived. The strike did not destroy. It disrupted. It broke the rhythm the devourer required to feed. Cross felt the recoil pass through him like a tide reversing direction. Awareness surged, then steadied. The alignment held. Moments stretched. Systems strained. The ancient fire burned itself into silence, spent not in fury, but in precision. What remained was absence reshaped, a wound in the predator's intent that could not be ignored. The void withdrew. Not fleeing blindly. Remembering. Earth remained intact. Minds remained lit. Thought endured. But survival did not feel like victory. It felt like responsibility accepted too late and carried anyway. The sky above did not change, yet nothing beneath it would ever be the same. This is the point where action meets consequence. If you are still here, do not look away now. Like this story if you feel the weight of what was risked. Subscribe to witness what survival costs after the threat retreats. And share this with someone who understands that endurance is only the first trial. What follows is aftermath, reckoning, and the truth that survival has a memory. After the recoil, the universe did not rush to explain itself. It waited. In the quiet that followed, instruments returned readings that felt almost familiar, as if reality were easing back into patterns it preferred. The voids withdrew beyond immediate reach, their paths no longer clean, no longer certain. Hunger had been interrupted. Memory had been made. Across sealed rooms, no one celebrated. Relief arrived slowly, like breath returning after long submersion. It carried weight rather than joy. Survival had been earned, but it came with an invoice written in responsibility. What had been done could not be undone, and what had been revealed could not be hidden again. The chosen were not dismissed. They were observed. Evan Cross felt the alignment soften without vanishing. The crystalline order within his mind dimmed from razor clarity to a steady presence, like an ember that refused to go out. Awareness no longer pressed forward, but it did not retreat. The boundary between human intention and cosmic consequence remained thin. The travelers confirmed what many feared. The predator would remember this system. Not as a meal denied, but as resistance encountered. Earth had crossed from anonymity into recognition. Survival had a witness. Around the world, effects surfaced quietly. Astronomical data required revision. Long-standing models failed without obvious cause. Sensitive populations reported shared dreams of pressure and distance, of darkness moving away but not leaving. These were not warnings. They were echoes. Institutions began the slow work of accounting. Records were split, some sealed forever, others prepared for partial release. Language was sharpened to avoid panic while preserving truth. Cooperation continued, not from goodwill, but from understanding that division had become unaffordable. For those who had stood at the center, life did not return to normal. It redefined itself. Cross understood that the gift he carried was not power. It was obligation. To sense alignment was to feel imbalance elsewhere. To perceive coherence was to notice when it frayed. He was not alone in this. Others shared the burden, each carrying a fragment of the same quiet responsibility. The travelers withdrew again, farther this time, not in abandonment, but in trust. Guidance would remain possible. Dependence would not. Humanity had been tested, not to prove worth, but to establish intent. Above all, one truth settled into permanence. Survival had changed the species. Not biologically, but ethically. Humanity had learned that intelligence attracts attention, that creation invites consequence, and that silence is not always safety. The stars had not become friendly. They had become aware. The world moved forward beneath skies that looked unchanged. Children learned names for constellations without knowing which ones now knew them back. Life resumed, fragile and precious, shielded by choices made in rooms it would never see. If this telling has carried you this far, do not let it fade into abstraction. Like this story if you believe survival demands memory. Subscribe to follow what happens when truth begins to surface and the cost of secrecy comes due. And share this with someone who understands that the greatest danger after catastrophe is forgetting why it mattered. What comes next is disclosure, distortion, and the struggle to carry truth without breaking the world that needs it. Truth does not arrive whole. It arrives in fragments, shaped by fear and necessity. What had been sealed began to surface, not as confession, but as language carefully chosen to reduce shock. Statements were issued without context. Data was summarized without origin. Words were softened until their edges disappeared, and still, the meaning leaked through. The world sensed a shift before it understood one. Astronomers spoke more cautiously. Scientists revised models without explanation. Officials repeated phrases about anomalies and preparedness while avoiding the cause that bound them together. Transparency moved forward in measured steps, never fast enough to feel honest, never slow enough to feel safe. Distortion followed immediately. Speculation filled the gaps left by restraint. Some reached for wonder. Others for fear. Old myths resurfaced wearing modern vocabulary. Certainty fractured into belief, and belief competed for attention. The truth did not shout. It waited, patient and vulnerable. Those who knew carried a heavier burden now. Evan Cross was advised to remain unseen, not to protect him, but to protect the balance. A single face can become a symbol too quickly, and symbols burn faster than facts. The ember within him remained steady, a quiet reminder that awareness carries responsibility beyond recognition. Behind closed doors, a line was drawn. Full disclosure would come, but not yet. The world needed time to learn how to listen before it could be trusted with the whole of what had happened. Survival had been earned. Stability still had to be maintained. The travelers observed this phase without intervention. They understood distortion. They had watched it unravel civilizations more effectively than any predator. Truth delivered without care could be as destructive as silence held too long. Small confirmations slipped through anyway. A recalibrated telescope. A corrected trajectory. A peer-reviewed anomaly that refused to disappear. Each fragment tightened the weave, making denial harder without igniting panic. The story assembled itself in the public mind, not as revelation, but as realization. The cost of secrecy became visible. Trust strained. Questions multiplied. People felt something vast had brushed past them in the dark and left fingerprints behind. The sky seemed closer. The quiet heavier. Awareness had spread without a name. This was the most dangerous moment. Not when the predator approached. But when humanity decided how much truth it could carry without tearing itself apart. The chronicle presses on from here into confrontation with memory, authority, and the meaning of survival when innocence is no longer possible. If this telling has sharpened your attention, stay with it. Like this story if you believe truth must be handled with care, not fear. Subscribe to follow the moment when fragments become acknowledgement. And share this with someone who understands that disclosure is not an event, but a process. What comes next is the turning point where the world is told enough to change forever. Acknowledgement arrived without ceremony. It did not come as an admission of failure or a declaration of triumph. It came as carefully measured truth, released in language chosen to endure rather than inflame. The world was told enough to change its footing, not enough to lose balance. The sky had been watching, officials said. Not always. Not closely. But long enough. What followed was not panic. It was recalibration. Institutions adjusted their posture toward the unknown. Scientific frameworks expanded without collapsing. Education began to speak in longer timelines. History was reread with quieter questions. Humanity did not shout into the dark. It listened, unsure what listening would require next. For those who had carried the burden in silence, the shift felt heavier than secrecy ever had. Evan Cross remained unseen by design. Not hidden in shame, but protected from simplification. The world wanted symbols. The truth resisted them. The ember within him persisted, a steady reminder that alignment once achieved does not vanish, it integrates. Across cultures, reactions differed but converged. Some reached for faith, others for reason. Many for both. Old arguments softened when placed beside extinction narrowly avoided. The realization spread that survival had not been guaranteed by strength alone, but by restraint exercised at the edge of fear. The travelers did not announce themselves. They did not need to. Their absence became the message. Guidance had stepped back. Observation remained. Humanity had been acknowledged in return, not as a subject, but as a participant capable of bearing consequence. Records were opened further. Not all at once. Never all at once. Enough to confirm patterns, timelines, and intent. Enough to make denial costly. Enough to ensure that forgetting would require effort rather than convenience. With acknowledgement came responsibility. Defense doctrines were rewritten to include patience. Exploration was reframed around caution. Power, once celebrated for its immediacy, was reconsidered for its echoes. The species had learned that the universe responds not just to action, but to posture. The reckoning was not loud. It unfolded in classrooms, councils, and quiet conversations where certainty was replaced by humility. The greatest change was not technological. It was ethical. Humanity had learned it was not alone on its own planet, nor anonymous beyond it. The chronicle nears its end now, not with finality, but with inheritance. If you have walked this far through restraint, consequence, and choice, remain present. Like this story if you believe acknowledgement is only the beginning of wisdom. Subscribe to witness the final turn, where legacy is defined and the future is claimed without illusion. And share this with someone who understands that truth does not end fear, it gives it meaning. What follows is the closing measure, where memory becomes guidance and survival becomes a vow. Legacy is not what survives. It is what guides. When the last confirmations were released and the noise of argument settled into something quieter, the world discovered it had crossed a line that could not be erased by time. Humanity no longer stood alone in its own understanding. The universe had answered, and the answer could not be unheard. Life continued, because it must. Fields were planted. Cities woke and slept. Children learned words for stars that now carried deeper weight. The ordinary rhythms returned, not unchanged, but steadier, as if shaped by a truth finally acknowledged rather than avoided. Those who had stood closest to the edge did not seek remembrance. Their role was complete not when danger passed, but when silence regained meaning. Evan Cross withdrew from public life by design, not as a figure hidden, but as a boundary respected. The ember within him remained, quiet and enduring, a reminder that awareness is not an achievement, but a responsibility carried daily. The travelers were not seen again. Their absence became continuity rather than loss. Observation remained, but interference did not. Humanity had proven capable of restraint under pressure, and that mattered more than strength. The universe does not reward power alone. It remembers posture. Institutions adapted slowly, unevenly, but forward. Exploration embraced humility. Defense learned patience. Knowledge widened its lens to include consequence alongside curiosity. The species had learned that intelligence is not a crown, but a signal, and signals invite reply. The most important change did not appear in technology or policy. It appeared in memory. The knowledge that survival had not been guaranteed. That extinction had approached without spectacle. That awareness itself had been the battleground. This memory settled into culture like a quiet oath, shaping choices long after fear faded. Humanity had been spared, not because it was special, but because it was willing to choose responsibility when force alone was insufficient. That distinction mattered. The chronicle ends here, not because the story is finished, but because its purpose has been fulfilled. What remains is vigilance, humility, and the understanding that the universe listens, even when it does not speak. If this telling has stayed with you, let it do so deliberately. Like this story if you believe memory is the truest form of defense. Subscribe to carry these chronicles forward, where hidden truths are handled with care and consequence is never ignored. And share this with someone who understands that survival is not an ending, but a vow renewed every day. The sky remains vast. The silence remains patient. And humanity, at last, knows how to listen.